Welcome everyone to GSBI Speaks. Today we're going to hear from 5 panelists who will be talking about this new report that is just coming out on December the 4th. We're very excited about it. This report is on the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity, status, challenges, and potentialities. And it came about because of the many partners we see over here. FAO is the lead coordinator, the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Soil Partnership, the European Commission, and of course, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. We're very excited about this and the number of scientists that contributed to this first ever global, really, assessment of soil biodiversity. So stay tuned, keep watching the FAO website, and listen to this webinar because I think it's going to be really revealing about why people get involved in these major international reports and why science needs to contribute to them. So just before we get started, I'd just like to give you a few ground rules on how this is going to work. The chat room is not operating, so put your questions and your name in the questions and answers. Then also we're going to record this video, this webinar, and you'll be able to get it and we'll let you know later when we have it up. And so first I'm going to introduce Richard Bardgett, who will introduce the panelists. They will go through about 5 minutes of remarks about the report and their involvement in it. And then we'll just open it up to everyone for questions and answers. So be sure and put your questions and answers in the Q&A. And we apologize in advance if we don't get to every single question. We have a lot of people signed up for this webinar, and we know there are going to be lots of questions. And that would be pretty much it. And so now I would like to invite Dr. Richard Bardgett, who is a member of the GSBI Scientific Advisory Committee, and he will moderate this session right now.
Thank you, Diana, and hello and welcome to everyone to this GSBI Speaks webinar, which is about the first global biodiversity assessment from science to policy. And this is actually part 1 of 2 webinars that we'll be running on the forthcoming State of Knowledge of Soil Biodiversity report, which, as Diana mentioned, will be launched in conjunction with World Soils Day on the 5th of December this year. Now, on today's panel, we have 4 members. We have Kelly Ramirez, and Kelly is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, and she focuses on the diversity and distribution of microbial communities in the soil. Kelly was also one of the managing editors of the report. We also have Elizabeth Bach. Elizabeth is an ecosystem restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, and she works on tall grass prairie restoration, but with a particular focus on the role of the ecology of the soil. She was also a coordinating lead author on the report, so also had a significant role. We have Zöe Lindo. Zöe is an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and Zöe specializes in the study of biodiversity and ecosystem function relationships in the soil system. And she was also a coordinating lead author. And last but not least, we have George Brown. And George is a researcher at the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation in Colombo. And he's also professor at the Federal University of Parana in Brazil. And George specializes in the earthworm ecology and was also a coordinating lead author. Now, Diana said a few ground rules. We do have a very large audience, and after all the panelists have spoken for 5 minutes, we ask you to engage through the Q&A system to ask questions, which I will then direct to the panelists. Now, again, as Diana said, we have a lot of people in attendance, so we simply won't be able to answer all questions, but I can assure you that we will do our best. Now, I just wanted to say a few words about the report and just the background, general background to this area of research. Because soil biodiversity is an area that's very much out of sight and out of mind. And while scientists, farmers, gardeners have long recognized the importance of a living soil, it's only really in recent years that we've begun to fully appreciate how vast the diversity of life in soil is and how important that diversity is for a healthy soil. Indeed, the last 2 decades have witnessed what I would say is a remarkable surge in interest in the study of the biological diversity of soil. And I think that's reflected in the GSBI itself, in that we have, I think, over 4,000 members from many parts of the world. And as a result of that interest, there's been major advances in our understanding of how soil biodiversity is distributed at different scales, how it is affected by global change, climate and land use change, how changes in the structure and diversity of communities influence above ground diversity, the plants, the animals that we can see above ground, and also the functioning of terrestrial systems. Put simply, the study of soil biodiversity, I would say, is booming as a topic, and there is now increasing awareness of the importance of soil life for a healthy soil, and also the capacity of soil to deliver multiple ecosystem services. Now, this report, as Diana said, began from the GSBI. A small group of members felt that there was a need for such an assessment. And I just want to finish by saying why I personally think it's particularly important. And I've got 4 reasons. I think first, it represents a truly global effort by a large number of experts from all regions of the world. Second, we acknowledge that there are still major gaps in our understanding and knowledge of the diversity of soil, but this presents what is arguably the best available knowledge of soil biota, the functions they provide, and the services that they also provide. Third, it presents actions for the protection of soil biodiversity that we'll probably hear about, and also solutions that soil biodiversity can provide related to agriculture, climate mitigation, medicine, and the remediation of polluted soils, as just some of the examples. And finally, one of the things we really hope with this report is that it will serve to raise awareness of the fascinating but hidden diversity of soil and highlight its fundamental role in providing solutions to many of today's global challenges. So I'm now going to pass over to our panelists, and what we're going to do is ask them to address 3 questions. What were their reasons for joining this effort? What are the main messages from the report or their chapter? And how do they think this information will contribute or influence or shape soil biodiversity research and policy in the future? So with that, I'd like to now pass over to Kelly Ramirez, who will give her first presentation. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks. You can hear me all right? Yeah, right. So I'm Kelly Ramirez. I'm going to go a little bit off topic from the questions just because I was the managing editor of the report, or one of the managing editors, and I didn't have one specific chapter that I worked on. I'm going to share some slides because that will help us pay more attention, right, when we switch back and forth between things. Let's see here, slides. Yeah, okay. So, right, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso now. My interest in soil biodiversity for policy began back in 2012. So I got my PhD at the University of Colorado. I did some really cool research there on microbial communities and soils. And then I heard about this postdoc position that Diana had advertised for the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. And the aim of this program was to really put microbes on the map with regards to soil biodiversity. And I was the executive director of this initiative for about 1.5 years. And then I moved on back to research. I did a synthesis project with IDIB, moved to the NEO in the Netherlands. But all this time I kept in touch with Diana and the GSBI initiative, kind of bringing it along with my research. So if I was doing research at Leipzig, I wanted to have some role of soil biodiversity initiative in it. And the same for the NEO. And then right before I transferred to UTEP, there was this great opportunity to manage this report. And that was in conjunction with the GSBI. And I'll just say they let me go to Egypt to the COP, the Convention on Biological Diversity COP in 2018 to present on how soil biodiversity can be the nexus. And this was really cool because it's not just talking about my own research, but how all of the different research of soil ecologists, soil biodiversity can be collated together and be used in global agendas. One thing that we worked on with the GSBI was this atlas. Many of you have probably seen this beautiful book. And this is a great policy tool to show people in policy how dynamic and beautiful soil biodiversity is and how intricately it is tied to ecosystem services that we all rely on. I worked at the NEO with Wim van der Putten on opportunities for soil sustainability in Europe. So again, this is taking our research of soil biodiversity and translating it for use by policy and land managers. And a lot of different organizations have been involved in all of these steps. So like I said, soil biodiversity can integrate agendas. This was us back in 2012 when we went to Rio +20. And Diana was there to present on soil biodiversity. And this is George Brown to the other side of me. And so this was the first example of us going somewhere as the GSBI to really push the agenda that soil biodiversity should be included in policy, whether reports and because it integrates all these different UN agendas from biological diversity to climate change. And so that's when I went to Egypt to speak on soil biodiversity. And really to drive home the message that with this destruction of soils comes the loss of soil biodiversity and the services they provide. So it's imperative that we translate research to policy and manage agendas. Okay, so that's kind of the background of what I've been working on and how I became involved with the GSBI and translating scientific research to policy. I wanted to do this because when I only worked on research alone, sometimes I got too far into the weeds of the research and I was like, why does this even matter? If we keep publishing papers on soil ecology, it's interesting for us, but do we use that information for big decisions or even smaller decisions at the local and regional scale, right? How can we use our knowledge of biodiversity in the soil to change management or address conservation questions or restore ecosystems, right? And so I wanted to find ways that we could do this. And one part, as Richard indicated, this is relatively new. So the pathways weren't there. It wasn't like, oh, we have this great research and just pass it on to policy. You had to create those paths. So 2 to 3 messages from my chapter. I didn't have a chapter, but I would like to say that this was a wonderful opportunity for me to talk with over 100 scientists from around the world as I suckered them into writing different chapters and sections in this report. Because so many of these scientists that are on this report have been doing this work their whole lives. And so it's really great to see their knowledge be translated from a scientific paper into a report like this. And so the last question that I'm supposed to address is how will this information contribute to or influence soil biodiversity research and policy? And I really hope that it continues to create those pathways so it's easier for scientists to translate their research to policy. Hopefully it ends up with more funding for us scientists, right? That still need funding because if soil biodiversity is an important metric to use, then more funding will come our way. And I think last but definitely not least, it's just really important that soil biodiversity is one of the metrics of biodiversity. Biodiversity we think of as something that has to be like this beautiful mammal or tree or flower, right? But the below ground diversity really deserves a voice because it's so critical to our ecosystem services. And I think I'll stop there because Richard's video is on.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We're now going to move straight to our next panelist, that is Elizabeth Bach.
Hi, thank you, Richard and Diana. It's really an honor to be here today with the panelists and with all of you joining from around the world. And I do want to take a moment to wish everyone all the best for good health and calm spirit during these times. My reasons for joining this global effort really are rooted in my reasons for becoming interested in soil biodiversity in the first place. As a young student, I came to the realization that it's these living soil organisms that are recycling dead materials into the elements needed for living organisms to grow and thrive, both above and below ground. And over the years, as I've learned just how foundational soil biodiversity is to life on Earth, including humanity, it's become really important to me to share that message and encourage action to manage soils to sustain life on Earth. And that includes some time working with Diana with the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. In recent years, we've seen a tremendous growth of interest in soil in general, and yet this growth of attention hasn't necessarily reflected the living component of soil to the same degree. And contributing to this global effort was a unique opportunity to bring the spotlight to soil biodiversity. And it's been an honor to work with experts from around the world to bring recognition to soil biodiversity and its role in sustaining the future. I was a lead author on Chapter 3, which looked at soil biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And I'm being told my sound is scratchy. I will scoot a little closer to the microphone. So I was the lead author on Chapter 3, which looked at how soil biodiversity contributed to ecosystem functioning and services. And some of the key findings from this chapter are that soil organisms grow our food and fiber, filter our water, balance greenhouse gases to mitigate climate change, and support terrestrial and aquatic life. Soil biodiversity is a source for medicines and vaccines, provides important cultural and recreational opportunities, and is foundational to economic activities like agriculture. Protecting and bolstering soil biodiversity results in multiple benefits to humanity and can advance multiple sustainable development goals and global biodiversity targets. And the cool thing about soil biodiversity is it provides this holistic focus that can help us as communities and a global society advance multiple portions of these ambitious global agendas for a better future. So how does this contribute to soil biodiversity research and policy? Well, from the research perspective, this report illuminates many gaps in our current knowledge about soil biodiversity and its functioning. We have a lot to learn about soil biodiversity in places like South America, Africa, and Asia. Increased knowledge of soil communities in these parts of the world will deepen and expand scientific understanding of global diversity patterns and the mechanisms that structure biological communities both below and above ground. In addition, in recent years, we've seen a boom in soil microbiological research, which has really been tremendous to be part of. However, expertise in soil invertebrates like nematodes, earthworms, and mites is dwindling, and future research needs to both leverage sequencing technologies to help open up this world of invertebrates and build taxonomic expertise in our rising generation of soil biologists. We need everybody at the table to address these questions and understand our role better. And lastly, I'll argue from the research perspective, we need research that fully integrates full soil food webs and looks at ecosystem multifunctionality. The thing that continues to energize me about soil and soil biodiversity is how it provides this holistic focus, and we can think about more than one thing at one time by integrating all these parts. How does this report contribute to policy? This is the other cool side of this coin is, as Richard said, this report represents the state of knowledge as it is right now. And we do know a lot, and we know enough to recommend some actions. Soil biodiversity provides multiple services to us. And some of the things that we can do to support soil biodiversity today and for the future include protecting natural areas where soil biodiversity is already thriving and providing critical ecosystem services. This is also a boon to above ground and aquatic life as well. In degraded systems, ecosystem restoration provides a really important opportunity to bolster soil biodiversity and improve ecosystem functioning for people in local communities and around the world. In our working landscapes, employing sustainable agricultural practices is really critical to leveraging soil biodiversity to produce food that we need today and into the future. And lastly, I'll say adapting urban areas for soil biodiversity is really important. They play a key role in cities and pollutants. So I see Richard's back on video, so I'll end there and pass it on.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We're now going to pass on to Zöe Lindo. Zöe.
Thanks, Richard. And Diana for this invitation. Just let me get my screen up here. Okay. So this report represents a landmark opportunity to highlight some of the incredible diversity in and the importance of soil systems, and something that I feel has been, as Richard sort of alluded to, hidden in plain sight. Something that I also hope will change with the release of this report. And I think one of the reasons that soils and soil biodiversity has been largely overlooked, despite their importance and their ubiquity, is that they are cryptic systems. And therefore, studying soils has some unique challenges for us. The world of soils is small, it's brown, it's opaque, you can't see through it like you can air or water. And the vast majority of its inhabitants are microscopic. We don't know the names of many of these creatures, nor what they do, but we do know that biodiversity is extremely high in soil systems. And this image that I'm showing you here from the report is just an example of that. And this high biodiversity is part of our challenge, as well as that the ecology of the species is generally complex. Interactions among species are often indirect, and this makes quantifying their specific roles in the environment often difficult to measure. But we do know that these species form a food web that directly drives decomposition and therefore indirectly contributes to above ground primary productivity. And so soil systems are of parallel importance to ecosystem functioning as above ground systems are. And that's why I joined this global effort, to bring the previously invisible to the global stage and let others see what I see every day. As the lead on chapter 2, we highlight how the diversity of soils isn't restricted to just one or two broad taxonomic groups, but rather includes organisms across all domains and kingdoms, and includes organisms that most people have never heard of and few people get to see, such as columbella and orobatid mites. Soil organisms also span multiple orders of magnitude in terms of their body size, such that the soil food web is not just complex because of its diversity, but also because it has a nested, three-dimensional and hierarchical structure to it. The soil system as a complex food web plays crucial roles in the functioning of the planet, like decomposition, nutrient cycling, and the formation of soil structure. As mentioned, the soil food web is instrumental in decomposition. That's the breakdown and transformation of organic material into carbon and nitrogen and other elements, as well as into stored organic matter. As an ecologist, I work on the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem processes. Specifically, I examine how changes in soil food web structure, like the soil food web I'm showing you here, affects an ecosystem's carbon storage potential. And that's because 90% of all the above ground primary productivity is returned to soil systems for decomposition and nutrient cycling. And whether this soil organic matter, the largest terrestrial store of carbon on the planet, remains locked in soil systems or gets released to the atmosphere depends on soil biological communities and these soil processes. As such, soils play a major role in global carbon budgets, and therefore potentially hold the key to understanding future climate scenarios. And the soil food web is seen as a key variable of climate prediction models for global carbon stocks, yet soil communities and soil processes are not fully incorporated into these models yet. So given the importance of soil biodiversity in multiple ecosystem functions and climate regulation, my hope is that soil biodiversity will be seen as important a measure as plant or mammalian biodiversity when considering things like environmental impact, climate change mitigation strategies, and their related policies. Soils are as complex and beautiful as the oceans and equally important for the functioning of the planet. And yet the vast majority of people never get to see this wealth of diversity that exists right there beneath our feet. So my hope is that this report will inspire interest in the complexity and beauty of soil biodiversity and the soil environment.
Thank you very much, Zoe. And we're now going to move on to our final speaker, which is George Brown. Over to you, George.
Okay, thank you again, Richard. And let me just share my screen here. Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning to all of you who are participating in this webinar. Thanks for this invitation, Diana. And I'll be sharing with you today some of my experience in the science policy interface, in particular, my experience working with the FAO over the last few years, and more recently in the Global Soil Biodiversity Assessment. I'm going to go back in time a little bit and share with you tell you actually my involvement in this process has been for over 20 years, leading up to what is the International Initiative for the Sustainable Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, which is a cross-cutting initiative of the CBD. Even before this initiative began, there were some important things that happened in, for instance, the declaration of the International Colloquium Soil Zoology, which was sent by Dennis Parkinson to the CBD and then taken up by Sigmund Hagberg in a great paper in Applied Soil Ecology, talking about the relevance of soil biodiversity to the Rio Convention. Around that time, the CBD implemented the program of work on agricultural biodiversity, and various COPs called upon the parties to produce evidence and case studies of the role of, beginning just with soil microbes, but then expanded onto earthworms and all soil biota in the year 2000, and their importance in agricultural ecosystems for productivity and sustainability. Just after I finished my PhD, I was hired by the FAO for a couple of consultancies in the year 2000. And then I worked with Dan Benek, Adriana Montanes, Sally Bunning, and a few other people, and ended up producing a survey, a global survey on soil biodiversity, which many of you probably contributed to, an overview and case studies information that was used to produce the soil biodiversity portal of the FAO. And then the next year, the following year, there were a couple important events also. We presented some of this information to the Soil Biodiversity, so the Soil Ecology Society meeting in the United States, and then in Montreal in 2001 at the SBSTA, there was an important paper by FAO on soil biodiversity and its role in sustainable agriculture. So these were all important events that led up to the actual initiative, which was launched in 2002, but there was not a framework yet for that initiative and how it was going to work. And so in 2002, there was a meeting organized by Embrapa and FAO in which we participated, which led to the framework, which then allowed the initiative to actually work. And then that was approved at COP8 in 2006, in which we also had a side event on the topic. A few more important steps in this process were actually the startup of GSBI in 2012 at Planet Under Pressure. A few months after that, there was Rio +20 in Brazil, in which we organized this side event on truly global soil biodiversity initiative. And Luc Montanarella presented why we should go for a global soil biodiversity atlas. And then that was done and published in 2016. Great publications, great information. And then as Kelly shared in 2018, there was a call for the Global Soil Biodiversity Assessment, which is what we're talking about now. And my role in that was, together with Miguel and Monica and 43 other researchers and scientists from around the world, in identifying the threats to soil biodiversity at global and regional level. So these threats were identified, each one of them was reviewed, and the trends were analyzed in per ecoregion of the world. This is just a list of the threats. There's quite a few of them here. I'm not going to dwell on this, just to say that unfortunately desertification was one of the ones that was not addressed. Otherwise, all the other ones were addressed, and there were some great figures in that report, which you'll be able to see soon. In this case, it's an example of agricultural intensification with the drivers and the effects on soils on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the impacts on soil biodiversity. And they just summarized mainly that all these threats, the soil degrading practices, lead to threats to soil biota and their contributions to soil ecosystems. But the impacts of these threats on soil biodiversity and function aren't all the same, and not all the same in all the regions of the world. And furthermore, many of these threats interact with each other, often synergistically, so that their impact is even greater on negatively on soil biodiversity. Of all the threats, the most widespread and mostly recognized was loss of soil organic matter, and often associated with deforestation and agricultural intensification, which were some also important threats identified worldwide. But there are some important gaps for research, and that's important for us and also for the science policy interface, is that the knowledge of the impacts on soil biodiversity of these threats is highly variable depending on the region and the target biota. And unfortunately, soil biodiversity has been conspicuously absent in many global biodiversity assessments, such as the recent one from IPBES, and also conservation actions, both at the national and international levels, such as the IUCN Red List of Threatened Soil Biota. So we basically summarize the report by saying that policies that minimize soil degradation and protect soil biodiversity need to be a component of biodiversity protection at all levels worldwide. And so I thank you for your attention, and thanks again for this opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, George, and also thank you to all our panelists for your presentations, which were very interesting and provide a fantastic basis for the Q&A session that we're now going to move in. As I said before, what we're going to try and do is address as many of those questions as we can, but again, I apologize that there is a big audience and there will be many questions, I'm sure, so we won't be able to address them all, but we'll do what we can. I'll just ask all the panelists to come up on the screen so that we can actually see them. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is just go through the questions as we have them, and I'll ask one of the panel members to address that question. And the first question, which was actually the question that came up some time ago, is how can the soil biodiversity be an effective agent for soil remediation under stress? I'm going to ask Elizabeth this as someone working on ecosystem restoration. So Elizabeth.
Sure. I think this is a really great question because soil biodiversity straddles this role where it can be play an active role in that remediation or restoration process. And there's example of organisms that can directly degrade pollutants or take up heavy metals from soils that have been impacted from those sorts of activities. There's also a variety of soil organisms that are really important to help plants establish and to reestablish native plant communities when that's an overriding goal. Partners like mycorrhizal fungi, rhizobia for legumes are all really important in that role. And the specificities of that kind of depend on which ecosystem or the scope of the project you're working on. But yeah, I think that's one of the great things about soil biodiversity. And we're learning more and more all the time about the active role these organisms can play in restoration and rehabilitation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think this is quite an important question because it's one of the issues that is often discussed by policymakers, for example. So I'm going to actually ask all our speakers. But before I do, I just want to remind the audience that if you want to ask questions, please ask them through the Q&A session. So I'm going to go to George first. So George. You have to unmute. Sorry, George.
Just a minute. Repeat the question again so I can place
it.
It's
how can soil biodiversity be used as an effective agent for soil remediation under stressful conditions?
Okay, I will speak from where I come from in the knowledge of the invertebrates. And in fact, before you can provide adequate condition for the invertebrates to help in the remediation, you need to provide what they need to survive in those conditions. So topsoil remediation, including, revegetating, providing food, organic matter, and all those sort of things. So basically, if these aren't provided, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a really important role of these organisms in helping to remediate these areas. And this is, for instance, quite common in mined areas that then have topsoil placed back. And of course, it takes quite a while, depending on the quality of the soil that's put back and how many stones and how much organic material has been put there. But yes, once though they're there, there's even some really great examples of earthworms being inoculated again into some of these systems to help promote well, basically restructuration of these unstructured soils. So it's really important to provide the adequate conditions for them to come back. Once they're back, of course, they're going to contribute more and more importantly as time goes by to the restructuring and recovery of those systems.
Okay, thank you very much, George. Kelly, maybe you could give us some perspectives.
Yeah, I think I'll answer this more from a global change perspective. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately is if we want to think about bringing soils back to their whatever healthy state or remediating them, we also have to think about the question asked under stressful conditions, but we could say under global change. So what if that ecosystem now is warmer or is getting different levels of precipitation or these different pressures on the system? We can't just say we want to go back 100 years because there was grazing here at the turn of the century, they started grazing, and we want to go before that. We can't do that in most places because one, the people are still using the land, and so we need to think about who's using that land and why. And we're not just going to say, oh, we just need to put this back to its pristine state. Two, because our globe has changed, the climate has changed, and those changes are affecting soil biodiversity. And I think that we have to strategically create experiments that test and kind of project into the future what those stresses will be. And if it's right to remediate or restore soils, if it's in a mine, it's much more like harsh, and maybe that makes a lot more sense. Whereas if it's in a grassland and there's been some grazing, how can we work with land managers to say, okay, grazing stays, but we want to still get a lot of ecosystem services out of it, right? So always comes back to, it depends which system we're in. But I do think it's a really good question and something I hope that research continues in, because it's definitely been a kind of like there's a lot of these sorts of questions that soil biologists can answer or start working on now.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to change to another question now, because I see that we've got a few, but I'm still going to ask Zöe this question, because I think this is a particularly important one. This is from Sally Bunning. I should say that the previous question was from Emin Elbadri. Hope I pronounced that correctly. But this question from Sally is, she says that I think we need to also focus on how we can get practical applied knowledge from research to farmers and other land users and policymakers to reduce the use of agrochemicals, etc. So I wondered if you could give some insights in how you think best to achieve that.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I agree. This is also an important question. And in many ways, I think it relates to our first question as well, which is the impacts that we're having on soil systems at local, regional, as well as global scales. In terms of some of the stakeholders like farmers and some of the local scale stakeholders, I think, here in Southern Ontario, we're actually highly agricultural as well, and have been for over 100 years. And so our soils are relatively reduced. And so some of the ways that we can reach out to farmers is by getting them involved in active research as well. And so initiatives where we have students that can go and set up experimental treatments in small areas of their farming system, try different intercropping systems, vegetative cover, and things like that. And I think that relates back to what George was saying in the first question, that it's really about some of these basal resources for supporting the soil food web that are going to make the soil system healthy or stable, or whatever we would like to call it. But I think getting farmers involved in active research, whether that's at small or large spatial scales, I think is a great initiative.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Elizabeth, you're actually working on issues related to restoration in tallgrass prairies. So I wondered if you could perhaps give us some of the perspectives from that particular angle?
Yeah, absolutely. And I work more directly with land managers who are actively working on restoration projects, but I'm also located in a very agricultural community, agricultural context. And there's a tremendous amount of interest I find amongst land managers and farmers. I come from a farming family, so my own family brings this up on occasion too. And I think that just feeding that interest is really going to help us take some big steps forward, and recognizing that it's okay that it's complicated and that we don't know all of the answers, but to be sure that we know some, and we can make some good recommendations for steps forwards. And I think Zöe and George's point about feeding the soil community, I think of it as feeding the soil community so it can feed us, and really thinking about it as a whole cycle. It's not just putting your crop in March and taking it out in October. It's about what's happening over the winter for that system to be ready to grow a crop next year. And if we're thinking about it in that sense, we can also take a step back from thinking about, oh, I need to do a checklist of inputs every year to make this happen. And this comes down to that direct question about agro inputs, to realize what our soil and our soil communities can provide by themselves. And in some cases, we may need some additional input, but to do that in moderation and thoughtfully with the whole system. So yeah, I think there's interest there, and these are really important areas for us all to be engaging in.
Thank you. I mean, this is really a key topic in soil biodiversity research and also for the report. So I'm just going to get one more perspective actually from George on this, because you work in very different systems, agro-ecosystems in Brazil, for example. So I wondered if you could give us a few of your perspectives as well.
Yes, actually, there are two very important things that occur in Brazilian agriculture which have to do with soil biodiversity. One of them is the very large amount of no-tillage which is used in our country. And we know that by fact, many experiences showing that this is a system where many of the soil biota have a very important role. And yet there's still improvements that can be made in that, so that there's a synergistic working in the sense that, you know, you're not only are you providing lack of tillage so that there's more protection of the soil, but also providing the adequate, inoculants, the adequate crops that can fix nitrogen, the microbes that can contribute to, whatever rock phosphorus solubilization, all sorts of aspects of this interactive and synergistic management, the crop rotations, not including trees, including what we call here in Brazil, the integrated production systems, where you have rotations with pastoral period, with crop, with plants that are feeding animals. All these contribute to basically improving the soil biota and reducing inputs. So this has been a really great experience here in Brazil, and I think it's applicable to many other places in the tropics and subtropics worldwide.
Thank you, George. I should say we also had another question which is related, which I think has covered that, and that was from Ellie Moriam, which was about how we can integrate knowledge on biodiversity to land management. But I think that's sort of been addressed to some extent in those questions. Now, another topic that seems to be coming up quite a lot in the questions is to do with global scale analysis of soils, in that there's been quite a lot of effort recently in creating databases. And it's been also revealed that there are some blind spots in those databases. And there are two questions that have come up very similar. One's from Louisa Durkin, which is, if you are looking to identify risks to soil health, what global sets are the most meaningful? And more specifically, what global data sets, things like carbon, erosion, soil depth, etc., are most meaningful? And also one from Paul Cardell, which raises a similar issue, but it's about global maps and the gaps that exist, in that most of the data, about 90%, is coming from Europe, North America, and parts of China. And he's asked, what initiatives can we take to fill those large blank spots in other continents? And I'm going to take this one to Kelly, because I know you do quite a lot of work on global scale analysis of soils.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the questions, Louisa and Paul. So I'll start with Paul. I think this is a really great question. We've seen a lot over the last 10 years, really, since high throughput sequencing of these global studies. And you're right, they are mostly in a few select areas. And I think some ways around this we've seen is collaboration, working with scientists in other countries and finding ways to collect more data. And that's one reason the value of this report is to really highlight there are some big gaps in where we're sampling. And so that's like one of the, hopefully the solutions. If that's a huge gap, then we come back to the policy and say, policy people, we need help doing, like getting us to do that research, whether that's funding, whether that's whatever mechanism that is. So I think a report like this is really important. Let's see, I'm reading, I do think something else that you're kind of got at here is, and then goes to Louisa's question, like what information is the most important? And that's such a great question, right? If we just want to know if there's a lot of a biodiversity hotspot, sure, abundance and diversity is really all we need. But what about these other soil metrics like carbon, erosion, soil depth, etc.? And I think it depends on what organism you're thinking of, or what ecosystem service you're thinking of. Getting them all overlapped is still pretty difficult, right? We have a new paper out on earthworms and the distribution globally, and we can relate that to plant diversity and carbon, but like how do we start to integrate in fungal diversity or bacterial diversity? And then within bacteria, what are those specific functions? And I do think that we've kind of reached a point where we've made enough maps with the abundance and diversity maybe of bacterial communities, but now it's like the next step is functions and other organisms together overlapping. So somebody should write that proposal. But I do think these are gaps that we have highlighted in our report. So hopefully that's a direction that we continue to go.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question of Zöe, actually, particularly about these gaps in knowledge, which, as Paul has pointed out, is we have lots of information from Europe, North America, etc., but these enormous or complete lack of information in other parts of the world, particularly Africa, South America, etc. And how can we actually overcome this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, how do we address these gaps? Well, my immediate response is more money, more funding for basic research. But thinking about here in Canada, where we have such a big land base and we have so few researchers studying soil and soil biodiversity, it's exceedingly hard to get across the country and to actually understand who's there and what's there and fill some of these gaps. And that's where I think coming back to the related question about some of these other global soil data sets, some of these can be, I think, indicators. So for instance, carbon, the amount of stored soil organic carbon is often an indicator, at least of abundance. For many of the major taxonomic groups. It might not be necessarily for the richness, but definitely it is for the abundance of a lot of the soil organisms. So how do we fill in some of these gaps across very large areas where we have very few researchers other than throwing money at it? That's actually a really good question. We're working on it. Yeah, but hopefully, in a report like this, particularly. Most of you, I think, haven't seen the report, but when you do, I think you're really going to love it because it's so beautiful. And it highlights these organisms that, like I said in my presentation, most people never get a chance to see. And I think when people start seeing these organisms and how beautiful they are and how interesting they are, then hopefully we'll get more interest as well as more funding and be able to fill in some of those gaps.
Okay, thanks. Another couple of questions that, that's about sort of spatial gaps in soil biodiversity knowledge, but another issue which has been touched on is taxonomic gaps, in that we have information for some organisms, perhaps the more obvious ones like earthworms, for example, but other groups of organisms we know very little about or perhaps are less attractive to study. And one of the questions we have here we have two questions, actually. One is from Matt Turnbull, who says only a small proportion of soil organisms have been identified. What policies or research funding priorities can be implemented to address that gap? But also a related question is by Isabel Feeks, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do you think that red lists for soil organisms is a good idea? I'm going to ask Elizabeth to address that first question, really, about taxonomic gaps, and then I'll come to the other one afterwards.
Sure, and I think that's a great observation. Sequencing technology has really expanded our knowledge of bacteria and fungi to a great extent. And these were areas that we really lagged prior to sequencing technology. So it's been tremendous to see that growth. Some of these more microscopic invertebrates are really challenging. There's less funding for that kind of research. There's less taxonomic expertise. I get the impression that taxonomic expertise is aging as well. We need more young researchers really engaged with those organisms. And I think building that interest in the way that we teach students at all levels is really critical to spark that interest so that people have that passion and push those fields forwards. I think that's really where we see lagging right now, is that organisms that are too small to really see without some microscope enhancement, but are don't have the sequencing technology, that the primers don't fit well for those organisms yet. And in general, those organisms, there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity we don't know about.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the same question to George, actually. I mean, you predominantly work on earthworms, which I said was one of the more obvious organisms, but obviously very important. But I wondered how you felt about gathering interest in other taxonomic groups that are clearly important in the soil.
Yes, we've been quite lucky here in Brazil because we have some pretty good taxonomic expertise for some organisms that are quite biodiverse, like ants, beetles, but not so much for other organisms like mites and nematodes. But there is a great program here in Brazil, which is run kind of like the equivalent of the NSF in the USA, which is the CNPq program of taxonomic capacity building, which has been going on for the last 15 years almost. And this has been crucial to maintaining these students who do get interested in taxonomy to staying and actually eventually finding jobs that can maintain their interest and pay their salaries while they continue to do taxonomy. So this is the kind of thing that is essential that governments be serious about doing if they want to tackle this taxonomic impediment. And Brazil is host to like 10% of the biodiversity probably for the world. Like I said, there's some negligence groups there that really need to be worked on. But this kind of policy at the national level is crucial for that. Now, it doesn't just depend on us getting the students interested. They later then have to be able to get a job to keep active in the field. So.
Okay. Yeah, I've got another question actually for you, George, because it's about how you can actually get farmers involved. This is a question from Patrick Lavelle, and he's asked about how you can get farmers actually involved in evaluating soil biodiversity and make them the actual actors in building the public and policy appreciation to support sustainable agriculture, for example.
Sure, we've had a few good experiences with this in Brazil, of course, mainly with earthworms. And because they're just so easy to see and easy to catch, and basically you can show the differences between the worms that go a lot and the worms that don't, and the worms that are colorful and the worms that aren't. And they're great instruments of environmental education, because don't just see them, but you see what they do in the soil with the holes and the casts and the poop. And you can do all sorts of things with those organisms that show the importance of why we should have more of them and not, consequently other organisms too. We don't want to just focus on them, but if you feed the worms, you're going to basically be feeding a whole suite of other organisms also, because you're taking care of your soil. And this has been really useful for us working with farmers, mainly in the No-Tillage Association here in Brazil, which we've had projects over the last few years. And yes, sometimes they accompany us to the field, and they don't just let us work on their field. They sit around and ask questions, and those are great moments for us to share what we know. And then sometimes they get really excited, and pretty soon others, their neighbors or others, are also becoming involved or asking questions and wanting to know more also. So this has been our experience, at least, to share.
Okay, thank you. I mean, again, when we're talking about the taxonomy of organisms, we also come into the topic of conserving and protecting those organisms. And I just want to go back to a question that we didn't really address before, which was by Isabel Feeks, I think, again, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it was, do you think a red list for soil organisms is a good idea? And I'm going to ask Kelly that question.
I like that question because I don't really know the answer. And people ask this a lot, actually, when I give seminars to non-soil groups too. I think it's interesting. Like what George is talking about, there are some organisms that are visible, and it's a little bit easier to characterize them and say, yeah, we don't have this here anymore, and it could be on a red list. I think for the microorganisms, that's a really difficult question, because what really those microbes have are traits for metabolic functions that are important for ecosystems, right? So nitrogen cycling, or very specific, let's start with nitrogen cycling, right? Not all organisms can do that. They can transfer those genes though, if need be, right? There's like a different way to think about these organisms in the soil than our typical sense of species that we think about for organisms that are larger that you would collect for a museum, for example. And there's a question below that so the GBIF, right, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, they collect all this data on organisms, where they are, what was found where, right? For soil data sets, we can link a data set to a lat long, but if it's a high throughput microbial data set, it's really kind of doesn't translate to somebody else's high throughput data set. So we have to start thinking about questions of species, like for soil organisms, differently than we do for macroorganisms. So perhaps red list maybe would be, if we wanted, it would be more like red listing a specific site, because it's hard to predict or know exactly which organisms have been lost unless it's something like an earthworm that was really monitored. If it's a bacteria, like how would we even know? And so like instead, I think what we need to do is start changing our perceptions of a species idea, especially for microorganisms in the soil, and then use that for like this museum idea of where we're collecting points. We thought that's what I worked on at IDIV. So I know, Dimitri, that was your question. And Marcus Doring came down and talked with us. And it is really challenging because a lot of our soil diversity data sets are huge matrices of lists of organisms and their abundance. And how does that translate to a data set that's just like a panda was found here, right? It doesn't, because a panda is only one organism where my data sheet has like 5,000 organisms or more, right? I don't know if, it's a funny question. I think we're just at the beginning of things. And I think communicating with people who are thinking about modeling or organisms across the landscape from a more like GBIF kind of perspective, not just like projecting like some of us do in our work anyways, but collaborating with people who think about these things and have the computer power to do it. Soil ecologists need to get better about sharing our information and how we're doing that.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. I'm going to ask a similar question as Zöe, actually, but more in, I guess, a sort of related point is whether, which was also picked up by Kelly, is whether we should be focusing on protecting the habitats as a whole, or whether we should be looking at policy that is focused directly at actually protecting the biodiversity of soil. Because soil features in much policy, but it's usually in policy related to something else. So it's not central. So I wondered how you feel we should be moving forward in that.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe just to step back and address the idea of a red list and more sort of reiterate what Kelly was saying, that the red list concept just simply doesn't really work for soil biodiversity. A lot of the frameworks for protecting specific species don't translate well to soil organisms. And part of that is because of their size. They're so small. I've actually tried to get a mite red listed, and my ability, even as a taxonomic expert and field ecologist, to be able to get enough data to satisfy those criteria it was virtually impossible because of the scale that soil organisms interact with their environment. So yeah, sorry. So thinking more broadly about protection of soil biodiversity, I think in many ways it has to be definitely re-envisioned, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily a habitat specific. I think, again, what Kelly was sort of inferring is that it almost has to be a functional based assessment, which is exceedingly difficult because we're still working through the taxonomy of these organisms. We still, and again, relating back to some of the questions like Matt Turnbull had and noted, that we know so very little about these organisms, who they are, what they do, that getting it to that functional based assessment, I think, is exceedingly difficult. But I think it has to come back down to a functional based assessment, because it's really the role that these organisms play rather than who they are per se, that's important for sustaining soils.
Thank you very much. And that raises an interesting question about the actual function and the relationships between the diversity and function of organisms. And one of the questions that we have is from Wenjia Wu. Again, I hope I pronounced it right. Do you think there is a perfect combination of diversity and abundance of diversity of soil organisms can make the soil web function and work efficiently? And again, I'm going to ask Zöe that, because I know that's I've just asked you a question, but I'm going to ask you again because I know that's your area of research.
I love this question. And I would love to think that, yes, there is this perfect combination of diversity and abundance. And that's where I think of the soil food web as this comprehensive system. In ecology, we refer to high diversity, highly interactive systems as complex adaptive systems. And that means that within this complexity, it allows for a flexibility when changes occur, for instance. And so the way that I think about soil food webs is even just breaking it down into multiple channels of how energy flow through this system. And it's because it is this dynamic system, and it allows for the system to be flexible when changes occur and to maintain that overall structure and function. And so I do think that when we lose soil biodiversity, we start to throw that off. We start to break those connections. We start to tip a balance towards one energy channel versus another. And it's really about those multiple channels and the way energy can flow through the soil food web that allows it to be what it is. So I do actually think that there is a perfect combination. I don't think that we know what that is yet. But I think we're getting pretty close to understanding it.
Okay, I'm going to ask Elizabeth the same question. I mean, do you think there's a perfect combination?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I think my perspective on this is there may be, but it might be different depending on the type of ecosystem or situation you're in. And that perfect combination for a desert might look really different from that perfect combination for a wetland or an agricultural soil or a mountain or a prairie or a forest. And so I think, I think this is a great avenue for us to continue to explore and look into. And it's certainly the kind of answer that would move things forward, both for policy and land managers and farmers to feel like there's a goal there to get to. But to keep that perspective that it's going to look different in different parts of the world and in different ecosystems, and to keep that in mind. Yeah.
Okay. And what about one of the other questions about is about sort of artificial use of microbes. And I assume this person, it's Masakib Bekai, and I think he's talking about soil inoculation. I hope I'm representing his question correctly. But I mean, how do you see a role for those? You've talked a lot about encouraging diversity, feeding the soil to improve the organisms, etc., and their activities. But what about introducing organisms? I'm going to ask George this question, because you talked before about feeding the soil to benefit the earthworms, which would then benefit other organisms. But what about adding organisms?
Well, in terms of the microbes, I'll let Kelly answer that. Sorry for barging in on this, Richard. But in terms of introducing organisms, such as larger organisms like earthworms, for instance, this is something that you know, I was challenged with when I arrived here in Brazil. Was for the no-tillage system, for instance, how can you inoculate deep burrowing, you know, anisic type earthworms that are going to take the litter and stabilize that organic matter that's accumulated on the surface further down and help promote carbon sequestration and all that kind of stuff. And really, because we have very few of these kinds of earthworms here in Brazil, and my gut reaction is always, well, you know, a lot of organism introductions throughout the world have wreaked havoc, you know, have caused more problems sometimes than they really were aimed to solve. And so, you know, thinking of what you're going to introduce and where you're going to introduce it is very important. And, you know, if it's an ecosystem that's basically well and contained, and you can guarantee that that's not going to go wild and that it's going to spread all over the place and that it's going to become an invasive species, then okay. But otherwise, it's always an issue of bringing in an exotic organism or an organism that's not native from the site, and what problems that may cause. Now, if it's a species that's already present and it's just re-inoculating it, of course, then that's fine. But for our experience with earthworms is that it's really quite difficult. You know, you have to again feed that organism and maintain it in the soil, and you have to think of a whole suite of management practices that will allow it to stay in the system and contribute to its ecosystem function.
George. So Kelly, what about microbes?
Yeah, I think what George said, it would be the same for microbes, just willy-nilly, like thinking that one soil could easily be transferred with the microbes could be dangerous. If you don't know all the organisms there, you could bring a nematode that is a pathogen, right? I do think that there are, so at the NEO, yes, Jasper Wubbs did a really cool study where they transplanted topsoil to like a barren field to see what would happen. And they did multiple ways, like sterilizing at first, if it's just the seeds that go on, versus with microbes in the seeds. And that was really a lot better. So there are, but they're taking soils from not that far away. They're from the same region, right? Or even pretty locality. So I think there can be some clever ways to do that. Some other thoughts, instead of actually adding an organism, it's perhaps promoting organisms that you think would be better for your system. So perhaps you just need to add a lot of carbon and nitrogen to get the microbial community going, the decomposition cycle going, and then you're gonna have that food web build back up again, right? So it might not, the microbes might already be there. They might already have those functions for those, just those basic soil functions that we think about. And then it's like, how can you layer on the rest of the food web? If the microbes start being really functional and the nematodes are happy, then and the mites are happy, you know, like it's kind of going from there, thinking of it as a bottom up approach in size of organisms. That's what I would say. I think it's a really interesting topic though. And I don't think that we're close to having one answer for it, because again, if you're thinking of doing this in agriculture, it's really important to worry about pathogens. But if you're thinking of doing this maybe in just a grassland, you don't have to worry that much, because you're not relying on that crop to survive, and probably a high plant diversity can overcome something that you bring in. Yeah, that's sort of some thoughts.
Okay, thanks. A lot of the questions that have come in have talked about threats to soil biodiversity. We talked a bit about how we can encourage biodiversity and the beneficial sides of biodiversity, but there's quite a few questions coming in about what are the main threats to biodiversity. And one of them, it sort of picked up on me, was from Jean-Pierre Kaliman, who asked the question a while ago now, actually. And it was about, is all agricultural intensification negative for soil biodiversity? Because we often talk about intensification being one of the sort of biggest threats, or land use change as well as being one of the biggest threats, but is it always a bad thing? And I'm going to ask George that question.
Yes, I saw this question and I thought it was great because yes, there's all kinds of intensification pathways, and there's all this talk now about sustainable intensification pathways. And of course, these are means of obtaining more from your area, per unit area, but not necessarily putting more in. So it's oftentimes a question of making the system more efficient in what it does. And so including certain plants that can be deep rooted, that can bring back grab the nutrients that have leached, or including plants that are nitrogen fixers, so that you can add nitrogen to the soils for the coming crop, or the coming pasture, or pastures that are mixed with legumes and grasses. So all sorts of pathways that involve a lot of management tweaking, in a sense, so that you are improving nutrient cycling, internal cycling within the system. And then of course, if there are particular inoculants that you need to do, like inoculate with nitrogen fixing bacteria, yes, you go ahead and do that. And so various techniques are already available for improving management and intensifying the use of the land without necessarily bringing on more inputs and with reducing cost to the farmer. So those are means of ecologically intensifying agriculture without leading to soil degradation.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask the same question of Elizabeth, actually, because again, you work on sort of restoration, which is a different kind of context. It's the opposite almost. But I mean, again, would you say intensification is always a bad thing, or can it be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I thought George's answer was really lovely for this, and that it kind of depends on how we think about intensification. And if we're really thinking about it as building efficiency and bolstering ecological connections, that could be a boon for soils. Yeah, in my work, we're exactly thinking about the opposite of how do we take land that's been intensely farmed in a row crop context. These are usually corn and soybean fields, and bring plant diversity and animal diversity back to that, and these soil communities are a huge component of that. So we're often thinking about how do we get more carbon and nitrogen into that system and reestablish those food webs and create, I guess, a tighter system, a more efficient system. And that could be a way of thinking about ecological intensification. And it's also, I think, in kind of a landscape perspective, useful to think about mingling restoration work with agricultural work within a landscape so that they're both benefiting from each other. And restorations can help balance some of the, I guess, outputs from an agricultural system, and agricultural systems can benefit from things like increased pollinators and natural pest control from these restorations. So from a bigger landscape perspective, that might be another great way to look at that.
Okay. I'm aware that we're running short of time. We've only got about 15 minutes left, and we've got quite a lot of questions, and quite a few of them are asking about a topic we discussed earlier about actually translating soil biodiversity knowledge into practice, which is something we talked about. It's something we talked about when we were introducing the subject. So I just thought I'd spend a bit of time on that particular topic. And one of the questions, I'm afraid I can't see who asked the question at the moment, but it's one that seems to be quite common. I'm going to actually ask all of you this, so I'd ask you to give a short answer if you can, is what would you say are the biggest barriers to actually getting this knowledge into policy and into practice? And I'm going to ask Zöe first. She looked the calmest when I asked that question.
Oh dear. The biggest barriers, I think historically the biggest barrier has been almost the fact that soils are so ubiquitous and they're everywhere. They're right there beneath our feet, that we do tend to forget about them. We tend to forget about the functional role that they play, not just in agricultural systems, but some of those broader functions like climate regulation. And I think the biggest barrier historically has just been that they've been ignored. And I think that's why reports like this are so important, because they just bring our knowledge to the forefront, and they put it in front of the policymakers. And I think just that information going forward will translate into policy, because I think our research is clear. Soil biodiversity play an important role in the functioning of the planet, and we can't afford to ignore it anymore. And I think once we just bring that information forward like we are, I certainly hope that it's going to translate into policy.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth.
Yeah, this is a great question, and certainly something I wrestle with, I think, on a daily basis. In my experience, when we're really talking with land managers and farmers, they want concrete information that they can bring into their daily practices on the ground. And that's things like, should I be inoculating with mycorrhizae for this rare species I'm trying to reestablish? Or should I be, managing to get more earthworms in my field? And it's very local and context specific. And I think one of the hurdles that we face is science is always looking for these big general patterns, which are super important because it helps us understand what works generally across the board. But sometimes that can be a bit of a barrier for providing really specific local advice, which is what a lot of managers and farmers really want to know. And so I think continuing to build this bridge, and people are working on it on both sides, but we still have a ways to go to bring that conduit from understanding general principles and advancing general principles and distilling those down to actions that people can do on the ground. So a lot of times I personally advise things like, well, feed the soil and benefit, and it'll benefit all these critters in the soil community, as opposed to rushing to inoculate when we're not sure if that inoculation could turn into a pathogen or an invasive species situation, because we know that feeding and supporting that community will be a benefit. And here's some examples in your specific context of how to do that, leaving litter on the ground, or altering prescribed fire regimes, that sort of thing. So I think that walking that balance of bringing that advice down to be as concrete as possible to land managers and farmers is really important.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Kelly now, but I'm thinking that you were one of the managing editors of the report, so you had a very senior role. So I wondered, in the context of the report, what kind of messages are there in relation to how we best achieve that translation to policy?
Oh, so I think that what we found is there's not enough pathways to get information to policy people, land managers, and also the public. And so since Zöe and Elizabeth talked about kind of like reaching land managers and policymakers, I think one area that is almost low-hanging fruit is like public. And someone actually put in a comment on, we should have a soil biodiversity museum. And education of soil biodiversity, while soils are ubiquitous, like Zöe said, the majority of people today are disconnected from soil. They get their food at a store, they don't have to go farm it. Perhaps they have a small farm in their backyard, but those little connections that the public can make with the soil can go a long way, because then it becomes something that the public is asking for in their environment. Kids grow up learning about soil biodiversity, and it grows up to be something that's important in their local government, perhaps. We see this in the Netherlands. They do a soil biodiversity count every year. So everyone knows what a nematode is in the Netherlands, right? So that public outreach, whatever it may be, if it's a museum, if it's, we did a paper on soil biodiversity in Central Park, and people loved that, right? They want to know that soil that is right outside their door can be interesting. The people that do the antibiotic work, where you could send in your backyard soil and people would look in it to see what new antibiotics were there. This is just community science. This isn't like a scientist went and collected all the soils. People went into their backyards and sent it in. And I think projects like that, breaking down the wall between the public and the science and helping communicate is a really great way to go, and like a different pathway to get in the end to policymakers. Maybe that pathway won't get to land managers, but I think that turned out to be like education in the public eye is one of our big gaps, I think, for sure. Few people learn about soil biodiversity in school, unless I'm your professor.
And actually, that I was going to ask another question, but it relates to that. Was from Kirsten Hofmockel about how,
Hi,
you know, what
Kirsten.
we can do as scientists to actually accelerate protection and policy and diversity. But again, I just want to go back with George to the barriers question, because again, you work in a very different context to many of us in Brazil. So I wondered if you could just say a few words about what you see as the most significant barriers to transferring that science knowledge on diversity into practice.
Okay, I think that actually what Kelly, Zöe, and Elizabeth have said basically apply to what I'm living with here in my institution and in Brazil. One of the things I'm sorry, I'm gonna not answer the question in that way. I'm gonna come back to why we did this webinar and why we thought it was important is really as scientists, why is it that we should be involved in this? And I think this comes down to one of the barriers, which has to do very personally with each of us, is that we need to choose to be involved, to become involved, and to actually get out of our little box and our comfort zone and expose ourselves to the media, to talking with farmers, to talking with policymakers, to going to these COP meetings that are probably a big bore for, in terms of scientists, because it's all, different language, it's a different world, and you're not talking science, you're talking policy. And I think it's one of those challenges which came to me in becoming involved in all of this. And I often shy away from it, very, very sincerely speaking, because it does really mean going out of your comfort zone. And it means that you're going to be exposed to things that you're not used to a language you're not accustomed to, you don't know very well. And that involves not just the policy, but the land manager often, because if not like Elizabeth, where you come from a farm background, or I actually grew up in a rural background, so it's okay. But for those who don't, it is really learning how to communicate and how to say to somebody the importance of what you're doing and why you should care about it. So I think that is maybe not, a global, big, humongous barrier, but it has to do personally with us. And I think as many of us who are listening and speaking now are scientists who are maybe used to a particular vein of work, it really means getting on a different train and boarding onto it and saying, okay, here I go. And getting that as a challenge and going forward and just keep going forward with it, because I think that we are a voice that needs to be heard and that has important things to say.
So the message from all of you is to get out there and communicate the importance of diversity to users and demonstrate how that can be. I am very aware that we're running short of time, but there are two areas that I just want to explore before the end. One is more about how you measure diversity in the soil. I mean, all of us have talked, and many of us give talks telling people about how diverse and incredibly the number of species in a handful of soil, etc. So that raises the question, if we're trying to communicate with landowners, farmers, about how on earth do you measure that diversity of soil in a meaningful way to give you any indication of how healthy their soil is. So again, I quite like everyone's perspectives on this. So I'd ask you to give a very sort of short answer, because we don't have too long, about how do we best use soil organisms to measure the health of soil? And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Oh, that's a great question. And it's a really important question. On the one hand, there's a lot of very technical things we can do in a laboratory to really explore and understand that. I think some of these efforts that Kelly mentioned about scientists leveraging people sending soils from their backyards or their local areas are really opening the door to these measurements that can do sequencing measurements in the laboratory or bring them to an expert who can analyze these communities is really important. And it would be, I guess I would love to see something in soil ecology similar to what iNaturalist has done above ground, where folks can be, even just sending electronic snapshots or uploading. I saw this worm, or I saw this bug crawling around, or this, this larvae, this grub, and really opening the doors that way. But it's really difficult. I don't think there's one measurement that works. I think we have to look at a variety of measurements.
Okay, so Zöe.
I agree. There's definitely not one measurement that works, and part of this is related to, as I mentioned in my talk, the fact that soil organisms span multiple orders of magnitude in terms of their body size. So one type of sampling for one type of organism is definitely not going to work for another type of organism. For me personally, I'm heavily rooted in taxonomy. Part of my interest in taxonomy is that I'm very visual. I get to see the organisms, and I have an inherent interest in them. I think they're cute, or they're beautiful, or they're funny, or they're interesting. And that's what keeps me interested. But that obviously doesn't work for some of the other soil organisms. And that's where I think we're making great strides in things like eDNA techniques, and also considering, again, coming back to functionality, so functional diversity, and some of those indirect measures, whether it's enzyme assays and carbon use efficiency, ecoplate type assessments and things like that, that can be done without the highly skilled taxonomic information as well. So I think there's a variety of approaches to study soil biodiversity, and I think it depends also on what your question is, what you want to know about it.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me when we're talking about these things as well is not everyone has the capacity to measure all these things as well. And we're talking about communicating with farmers, landowners, often in places where they won't have that technology available. So I'm going to ask George again that question, but with that in mind, about what measures they can do now to actually get some indication of the health of their soil. And then I'll come finally to Kelly.
Yes, that's true. We see a lot of great publications and papers going really deep into the sequencing era. And we find that, of course, that's quite difficult for many people to understand. Sometimes even ourselves, if you're not trained in the particular genetics and, metagenomics and stuff like that. So it can be also a completely different world, which is even harder sometimes to communicate to the land user and the land manager. I think that, in a situation of how to measure and what to measure, if we're going to be easy on the people who are actually out there, there are different ways of communicating that. You could have the samples sent to the lab, even if you're out there with a farmer. Many ways they sometimes got to be frozen. So there's a whole question of logistics of how to do some of these things. But easy measures that are easily visible, easily performable, and particularly something that the farmer or the land manager himself or herself can do are of course preferable in the sense that if there's even just a regular a magnifying glass or a scope that you can take and that you can provide is a whole world opened to many of these people. And so I think that there are simple things that we can do and that we often do in the field here in Brazil that do reveal the soil biodiversity, and that they're quite easy to measure. And I think those in situations where you don't have access to all of these great tech things are really quite good.
Okay, I'm aware that we've only got 2 minutes left, and there is a burning question that I want to ask all of you, and it's a very quick question, and this is one from Anya Krieger. So I'm just going to ask you all very quickly, because we've only got 1 minute left before I wrap things up, and it's what's your favorite soil organism? And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
It's always hard to choose. I think my favorite soil organism is probably an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, because I feel like they just do so much, and there's such a big network in the soil.
Okay, Zöe?
I have to go with orobatid mites, hands down.
Okay, Kelly?
I think Verrucomicrobia, because they're important, but we're just starting to like get into them. Though if I studied anything larger than bacteria, I would say tardigrade.
Okay, and finally,
Yeah,
George.
definitely cool. Well, obviously I'm an earthworm guy, so you know that's the way it's going to go.
Okay, well, we're coming almost to the end. I think we've got 1 minute left of the webcam. So I'd just like to thank all our panelists for their time, their presentations, and for their questions to all these answers that we've been asked. I'd like to thank the audience for the many questions. We've had lots of questions. And again, I apologize that I haven't been able to ask all of them. I've done my best to sort of merge different questions, but it's quite a difficult thing to do. But hopefully you've been able to learn a lot about the diversity of soil from different perspectives, and that we've addressed most of the points raised. Just a couple of final remarks in the last few seconds. I should remind you that the report will be launched on the December the 4th, which is the day before World Soil Day. So hopefully you'll all be excited about reading the report, where there'll be many facts and bits of information about the diversity of soil and its importance for different functions, and also addressing many of the questions that you've got. And the last thing I'd just like to say is that I also remind you to tune into the part 2 of this webinar, which will be on January the 21st next year. And there we'll have a completely different panel of experts discussing the first Global Diversity Assessment, which will have been published at that time. So you'd be actually able to see the report. So thank you all panelists once again, and thank you to the audience. And good morning, afternoon, or good evening.
Thank you all.
See you all.